about perceptions of liberty in the Coptic period, affective responses to socio-religious pressures in the Eastern Desert. So basically we are going to look at perception, affection and projection. Perception in that we explore people's reaction to something rather than the objective truth. Affection in that we are interested in how people evaluate something that is happening around them. And projection in that by looking into perception and affection we are going to explore what people project onto a situation rather than the actual situation. On the slide you have a brief overview of what we're going to look at. We're going to start with three key concepts with spatiality, liberty and emotions. Then we are going to dive into my hypothesis, what I call the Kellis axiom. Then I'm going to show you the data analysis, so my samples and results. We are going to go on with a brief discussion of what correlations there are between space, liberty and emotions, and I'm going to finish with a short summary and conclusion. In order for you to know from the word go what we are actually going to try to prove or to disprove in this paper, I have the Kellis axiom here on the slide already. So X, my villagers of Kellis, is free from Y, socio-religious pressures in this case, to do Z, to practice their beliefs or to live freely, through Z starring, forming a close-knit social network. Why this kind of shape of the formula, also what all those different terms mean, will become clear in the following explanations. Generally speaking, in order to test this axiom, we are going to explore the actual manifestation of subjective responses to an objective conceptualized state. So let's unpack all of this. We are going to start with space and spatiality, and Britain very nicely divides space into three different types of space, into Euclidean space, that is basically your objective or geometric space, or as the crow flies if you want to look at space between places. Then there's social space, which basically means space shaped by social organizations and human agency. A good example are transport networks. And then there is perceived space, that is basically how individuals perceive their immediate and not so immediate environments. Maybe there are attitudes such as taboos or preferences also, it could be positive or negative attitudes, that either make a space preferred or dispreferred. I have a simple example for you in order to show you why we need all three perspectives. We are going to look at the line that divides two major isocloses in England, actually runs through the Fens, very close to home. It's marking the southern limit both of this divide between sum, which I can only produce in the Southern English variant, and chaff, again mine is the Southern English variant. This is this major dividing line. Now the situation is obviously a bit more complex because we have a transition zone in the Fens for just one line, and age plays a role, etc. But basically what we are focusing on, there is a line, there is a divide, and we have the one isoclos to the north, one to the south, and we want to know how does this either transition zone or line come about. Now graph number 2 shows you the King's Lynn-Wisbech functional zone in the Fens, then the dialect boundary and the major roads, railways and waterways. So that is basically, as explained above, that is social space. This is space that is manipulated by human agency. And here we see, well, there are not that many connections or links, so basically we kind of created a line here because where there's no contact, you obviously have speaker groups that are more separate from each other. To kind of drive this, bring this point home, I have graph number 3, again the King's Lynn-Wisbech functional zone in the Fens, and now we are talking about population density. Again, we are talking about social space, about human mobility this time, because where there are no people, there cannot be a lot of contact or no contact at all. So what we have here is a dialect boundary very close to home that is conditioned not so much by Euclidean space, but rather by social and perceived space. We are not going to talk about the Fens for the rest of the paper, but we are going to talk about the village of Kellis, so let's quickly have a look at this. The village of Kellis is located in the western Egyptian desert, in the Dakhla oasis to be more precise. It covers an area of about 1 square kilometre, and our textual witnesses date from the 4th century AD, so that will be the period of time we are going to focus on. The area of the village can be divided, based on the textual and archaeological witnesses we have, into 3 parts, into houses 1, 2, 3 in the so-called North Building, house 4, and then the temple area. Travel to the nearest city in the Nile Valley, which is Thebes, takes about 2 weeks under ideal conditions. You can calculate that, for example, using the Stanford 2, which I did here. If your conditions, for example, your weather conditions are not that ideal, it will take you even longer than 2 weeks. Contact with the Nile Valley did, however, exist. We have evidence for that, for example, in our written witnesses, that people speak about traveling to the Nile Valley or having business relationships with people there. So despite this rather arduous journey, there were contacts. The other thing that is important in terms of contact with the Nile Valley is the community based around this figure of the teacher, who seems to be a high-ranking member of a religious community. And he occasionally takes villagers with him, either to study in the Nile Valley or to just accompany him. Kellis is home to a Manichaean community, and this is where the figure of the teacher comes in again. He seems to be a high-ranking member, not of any faith, but actually of a Manichaean faith. That's the idea we get. Bear in mind, this is a village community practicing this faith. We're going to look into Manichaeism a bit more. It's not a mainstream religion, but it is a village community. These are not kind of clerical superiors, but these are villagers following maybe this figure of the teacher. And to round this off, because we're obviously going to talk about text and we need to know what Coptic in Kellis looks like, and the Coptic dialect of Kellis is called L star, related to the Nicopolitan dialect. It is basically a southern Egyptian dialect with specific regionalisms that make it distinct. Let's move on to our second key concept, which is liberty, and here you see this explains to you now why my Kellis axiom takes the form it takes. So I have McCallum's three-part formula on the slide. X is free or not free from Y, to do or become, or to not do or not become Z. We are particularly interested in the Y component. The X component is for us the villagers of Kellis, these are our individuals, and the Z component is basically they want to live kind of their faith and also live their lives freely without any oppression. So we are interested in the Y component. What's the problem here? And in the context of negative liberty, you would define this Y component as an external artificial interference, something like a wall, a fence, etc. In the context of positive liberty, you would define the Y component as inauthentic forces. These are, for example, internal obstacles or desires. So basically, you're talking more about attitudes and not so much about actually physical barriers. When we looked at my Kellis axiom, you will have noticed my axiom was a bit longer. So there was an through doing, Z starring something in there. This is Taylor's kind of what I chose there is Taylor's four-partite formula, and this ties in with so we have to talk about this Z star component, which could either be according to a non-instrumental exercise concept, so it could be in doing something, you are just by, basically without actively interfering here, but by doing something, in doing something, you will achieve something. Or I chose through, which is an instrumental exercise concept, so I kind of assume that my villagers actually very actively do something about the situation. What we are, as I say, particularly interested in is the nature of this Y variable. These are the socio-religious pressures in our case, and we are also interested in their manifestations, so how do people react to them. We will have a little bit more of a think about the Z starring variable, so about the in doing or through doing something you will achieve something else, but we are not too concerned with that one. Now, let's actually have a brief look at Manichaeism, because that's the actual reason for any oppression in the first place. So Manichaeism is a faith based on the basic dualism of light and darkness. It has a hierarchical structure within the group of people. So we have these ecclesiae, these are the larger groups, and we have elects, which are basically clerical superiors, and then we have catechumens, which are lower level clerical people. And they are obviously also kind of simple believers. We could call them, most likely, most of our villagers will fall into this last category. There are a couple of catechumens, but mostly they are just kind of believers who follow this faith. Manichaeism was, as already mentioned, not one of the mainstream religions, particularly in the wake of Christianity. It was really not a mainstream belief, so we find a lot of persecution and criticism about Manichaeism. And in order to illustrate that, I have, and I'm not claiming this list to be complete, I have a list of anti-Manichaean literature dating from the 4th and 5th centuries for you, which gives you a good idea that there was quite a lot out there against the Manichaeans. As a consequence, our manichees and groups obviously had strategies, coping mechanisms. One is anonymity. They have a tendency to avoid names, so the members of our community often remain anonymous. The other obvious one is dissociation, so you can kind of make sure that your group of Manichaean believers is dissociated from your larger societal groups. From this reason for any oppression, let's move on to the perception of oppression, to emotions. Emotion is, as defined by the Dictionary of Media and Communication, very broadly an imprecise term for any affective psychological state, including happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, surprise, and fear. In terms of linguistics, and from a linguistic perspective, we usually distinguish between three types of how a feeling can manifest in language. We're talking about expressive utterances, when the speaker actually expresses their feelings, emotive utterances that trigger reaction, and affective utterances that are subjective or evaluative about something. We are most interested in the affective utterances today. We are going to focus on two ways in which emotions can manifest in the linguistic output, and that is attentional bias and eccentricity bias. Attentional bias means that your attention span is either longer or shorter depending on the type and valence of emotion that you are experiencing. It has been found that positive emotions broaden the attention span and negative emotions narrow it. It has also been found that low motivational intensity broadens cognitive scope and high motivational intensity narrows cognitive scope. Now today we are mostly interested in negative emotions because we are dealing with socio-religious pressures, so we are expecting a narrow attention span, and we are interested in high intensity emotions, so this will further narrow our cognitive scope. Egocentricity means that you're focusing on yourself rather than on the perspective of your interlocutor. What has been found is that where in a positive state of mind, you are less likely to adopt the perspective of another person. And in the negative state, you are more likely to adopt the perspective of another person, because the reasoning behind this is that positive emotions promote automatic responses. They are processed in a bit more shallow way, and therefore promote automatic responses. However, again, we have to take into account that the intensity of the emotion plays a role here. So we're not just thinking about positive versus negative, we're also thinking about high or low motivational intensity. So in this sense, it has been found that individuals in a positive state tend to process information more shallow and global than individuals in a negative state. Now, in addition to those two biases, we have to think about how language and emotion relate to each other and or are linked to each other. And Foolen, apologies for mispronouncing that name most likely, claims that there's both a direct and indirect link between language and emotion, in that language reflects conceptualization of emotion and expresses emotion. And he gives us two very nice examples related to tasting something, and tasting something you don't like. So you could say yikes or yuck. That would be an expressive emotional outburst. That would be just expressing emotion. You could also describe what is going on. For example, his sentence, then I find that food disgusting. Here you reflect the conceptualization of your emotion rather than express your emotion directly. After having run through these three key concepts, let's define a data set which we can work with. And we are going to look at, as mentioned before, we explore the actual manifestation of subjective responses to an objective conceptualized state. Now let's unpack this statement. Actual manifestations is the linguistic output reflecting emotional involvement. So we can't look at internalized feelings exactly because they are internalized, but we have to look at the linguistic output. Affective responses, as mentioned, are subjective or evaluative responses to an event or state. They are not expressive ones, not our yikes or yuck. They are not emotive ones. They don't trigger a reaction, but they evaluate or subjectively give an opinion on an event or state. And as objective conceptualized state, It's basically how someone perceives certain circumstances, in our case, the socio-religious circumstances. I have a very fun example for you, again, close to home, randomly chosen. You have two maps of one Cambridge College on this slide. And these quadrangular open spaces that are surrounded by buildings are called courts in Oxford and courts in Cambridge. Thus, you have in essence the same underlying concept, but people's perception of this same concept differs, resulting in two different linguistic manifestations when referring to it. And the last thing we have to think about is we are talking about pressures. These are influences that are conceptualized as negative. So we are not looking at influences that are perceived as positive, but influences that are perceived as negative. Thus, my data sample or my data selection will be based on private letters, because we need a context where manifestations of emotions can actually surface. We will look at verb phrases in first person singular and first person plural, because we want our writers to express their own emotions. We will look at how outsiders in the outside world are conceptualized, and that is the best we can do. They don't talk, as I mentioned, very openly about their faith. And we will look at two very strong negative emotions, at physical pain and mental distress. Because physical pain would suggest, if they kind of refer a lot to physical pain, that would suggest we have some kind of external barrier, maybe they're actually physical attacks. If they focus on mental distress, that would rather suggest a more attitudinal barrier. Let's come back to our Kellis axiom for a moment, just to remind you. So we said X, the villagers of Kellis, is free from Y, socio-religious pressures, to do Z, practice their beliefs or live their lives freely, through Z starring, forming a close-knit social network. So as mentioned, we are using Taylor's quadratic axiom here, X, Y, Z, and Z star. I decided to go with an instrumental approach because I think these close-knit social networks, they don't happen, but they are actually, I see them as a very conscious reaction to what's happening around the people, around our group of people. And I phrase this whole axiom in terms of positive liberty. So our Y component are pressures rather than physical barriers or attacks. A couple of caveats here. Remember I said contacts with the Nile Valley in terms of business and education do exist. So there's there's contact of some sort, there's not nothing. And it's generally speaking, we're talking about a general southern Egyptian variety of Coptic with some regional features, that there's no complete seclusion to the extent of retreating completely from societal interaction and communication, for example, by using a secret language. And remember, this is a village community practicing Manichaean belief, not clerical superiors, thus they draw less attention to themselves anyway. And just kind of as a quick reminder, because I have put social networks without any explanation in my axiom, a social network is in essence someone's social, the number of people someone gets in touch with, and the people these people get in touch with, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Social networks map the existence and kind of connections between users of a language, and that is quite useful when you're looking at how people interact or where varieties kind of change or how changes spread. Now, from the data set, as I said, I wanted to look at private letters from Kellis, and from this data set, I pulled three types of data samples. I pulled semi-formulaic passages stating the sender's trust in the addressee in order to show you that we have a close-knit social network. These phrases are very common when people write to the desert monks, to these monks that live in the desert and kind of are seen as figures that support you in the 4th century bilingual archives. And you have one example on the slide. The second kind of sample I pulled from the selection of letters is passages relating to the figure of the teacher, our Manichaean teacher, in order to show you that we have a community of practice in the Manichaean sphere in Kellis. Again, you have one example on this slide. And the third data sample I pulled from the collection of letters are psych verbs relating to physical pain and mental distress, two strong negative emotions, and we're going to look in more detail at what or why I chose these. Let's have a look at those psych verbs in more detail. So, as I say, my group of texts are documentary texts from Kellis. My Jolman register are set as private letters in order to allow for emotional outbursts to surface. Think about a contract or a list or a business agreement. There you wouldn't have the chance to see emotions to surface, or not emotions to manifest linguistically. My sample of instances, the way I got to it is I created a verb index for all these 89 letters with the relevant lemmata and passages. And then I looked for the lemmata that are relevant to physical pain and mental distress. pulled the passages out. In these passages, I checked that the verbs are in the first person singular or the first person plural. I allowed for prohibitives, for example, don't be afraid, don't be troubled, because there you project the emotion onto your interlocutor, so you can still assume that one of them is actually experiencing this emotion. I realized when I was going through all of those that I had to make sure that all the verbs are intransitive. A lot of Coptic verbs can be transitive and intransitive. So, for example, you could scare someone, or you could be scared, and you wouldn't have to change verbs. So I had to make sure that all the instances are intransitive because we wanted our writers to talk about themselves. In order to evaluate whether there's any attentional or egocentricity bias, I created two approaches. You can criticize them later. With attentional bias, we said that basically as your attentional scope narrows, you focus in on one thing, so on this one emotion. So my assumption is then that if you focus in, you basically, colloquially speaking, you go on and on and on about this. So the number of extensions that go with my verb phrase, for example, adverbs, etc., should be higher. For the egocentricity bias, I said, well, we are interested in the change of perspective. So I looked at the context of my verb phrases, my relevant verb phrases, and checked whether there's any reference to the other, you, a but, etc., after my verb phrase. And finally, I checked for strangers, foreigners, and borders in the data sample. I checked the instances of my verb phrases, the relevant ones. I checked Coptic lemmata, meaning stranger, foreigner, border, and strange, foreign, and kind of living by the border. And I checked the translation. I translated all the letters, so I could check for foreign, strange, outside, etc. I have to say as a caveat already, there are not many instances that are relevant here. So let's go to my results. I have the number of types of lemmata, verbal lemmata in my entire corpus is 326. The number of tokens is about 3,000. Of these, only 34 are relevant to our sample of psych verbs. 13 about physical pain, 21 relate to mental distress. And I have a total of 89 letters, as mentioned before. I have 4 highlight letters. The reason I call them highlight letters is that they show a number of attentionally biased expressions of emotion in the domain of physical pain and mental distress. And then there are 2 odd ones out, PKC 31 and PKC 80, because they also shift the perspective to the other, which is quite interesting because they have attentional bias, so we are going on and on and on about a negative emotion, but then you're also able to shift perspective to the other, which is quite unexpected. The reason in both letters is actually that these letters are very clearly sectioned. 31 is a circular letter written by the teacher to a group of people. PK80 is a very long letter, and they are both clearly sectioned, so in one section you have the strong emotion, later on you have to shift in perspective. Now, we want the data to answer 2 questions for us. How much emotion do people express, and how do they feel about the outside world? Let's start with how much emotion is expressed. The very simple answer is not very much. If we start with the attentional bias, letters with more than 2 relevant instances, including those with instances of physical and mental distress, are very few. It's only 8 out of our 89 letters. Passages in all the letters that were, amongst all the passages that I pulled as relevant, amongst our 34 passages with more than 2 additional elements, are only 11. 5 relate to physical pain, 6 to mental distress. So again, not a lot. Egocentricity bias, in the sense of you have a shift to the other, is again not particularly common. So you have 12 of our 34 passages show a shift to the other, 6 mental, 6 physical. This seems all quite balanced between mental distress and physical pain, and overall comparatively little. If you remember, we have 326 lemmata, we have about 3,000 verb phrases, only 34 are relevant in the first place, and of these 34, only a fraction shows strong attentional bias or any kind of egocentricity bias. How do they feel about the outside world? Well, as I say, there are not a lot of passages, but there are basically 3 strategies. We have cooperation, suspicion, and long journeys, which I counted here because they show that there seems to be an attitudinal boundary between Kellis and the outside world, so people don't like journeys or kind of conceptualize them as harsh. Only the instances related to harsh journeys and traveling correlate with attentional bias, I have to say. PKC 31, like earlier, is the odd one out, in that we see suspicion expressed with attentional bias, but also a lack of egocentricity expressed in the same letter. As I say, that is due to this being a circular letter with clear sections. Now let's correlate space, liberty, and emotions. I'm just going to go back to the sentence you've heard a couple of times already. So we explore the actual manifestation of subjective responses to an objective conceptualized state. Now let's start with space. The type of barrier is apparently a social space barrier. We don't have a wall, we don't have physical attacks, no evidence at all of this. The reaction to this barrier is kind of the perceived space, so it's people's negative reaction to burying, to travelling, I apologise. So we clearly do have a social space barrier here. Or not a social, or most likely kind of a social space barrier in terms of this, travelling is hard, and a perceived space barrier in the sense of you have a negative reaction to travelling. Liberty, as I said, we were interested in the Y and Z components. The Y component is what someone is free from, our socio-religious pressures, in the form of either physical attacks or perceived pressures related to dissociation. What we find in the data sample mostly, or the few instances we do have, is there's not really anything about physical attacks. So the Y component seems to be really just in inverted commas, pressures of an attitudinal kind. The desired goal is to live your faith and life freely. We'll look at emotions and cognition. So we have three types of emotions, or three types of emotional responses. We have affective responses. Comparatively speaking, this is not a lot of responses, full corpus of 89 letters, and if they are responses, then they are often moderate, just about 50% show a strong attentional bias. Responses can, moreover, also be balanced, about 30 to 40% show a shift of perspective to the perspective of the other. Then neutral responses, basically that would be your diplomatic option. You mention something, but you don't emphasize it, you don't comment on it. And then there's a no response, kind of that is obviously kind of spoken ex silentio here. This ties in with what people have observed about the Manichaean habit of omitting names and of forming exclusive groups. And I think this is quite a lot the case in our Kellis sample, admittedly. Before I wrap up, I want to put in a final caveat. There are some factors that mediate or intervene between the perception and manifestation in language, and which might help us to explain why our expressions of emotions are, comparatively speaking, so few in our data sample. One is the change of medium between thought and word. This is a limiting factor. Think about how when you want to express an emotion, expressive statements like yikes, yuck, etc. are not that common in writing. B, when you're writing, you're slowing down, you do things sequentially, versus when you are speaking, you don't have to do things too sequentially. You can kind of put in a lot, and you can speed up a lot, and you can go on and on and on about a negative feeling. So that's a limitation we just have to be aware of. We have to take into account genre and register, so emotional outbursts don't surface in any genre and any register. This is what I controlled for with my corpus selection, where I chose private letters, so that shouldn't be a massive problem after corpus selection. We wanted to know about social pressures, or socio-religious pressures rather. That was our parameter of interest, our Y variable. Basically, we are talking about we and the others. The others are not mentioned a lot. Think about, is that maybe not suitable? Are there social variables, kind of social network variables, societal rules that maybe don't allow these people to talk a lot about the others or the outside world? This is something to take into account. It is, to a certain extent, again, a limiting factor as well. And then, obviously, there is the risk of false positives due to linguistic development. Think about grammaticalization, pragmaticalization, etc. My very simple example that I came up with when preparing the paper was, I am afraid I cannot help. In that sentence, I don't feel fear, I'm not scared, there's no strong emotion involved. Basically, I'm afraid in English is just a pragmatic marker signaling politeness and hedging a negative response. It's not any kind of emotional outburst. Now, in English, I know that. In Coptic, I might not know that. So I have to take into account that I might have false positives. So basically, given these caveats, we know that we have to apply some filters. So we have to kind of be careful about corpus selection, we have to mediate, we have to say, well, why are there so few instances that are relevant? And that's the thing, we have to also account for missing values that might hold evidence ex silentio. So let's come to a short summary and conclusion. We talked about perceptions of space and liberty in Kellis. Space, liberty, and emotion were our three key concepts. We phrased our Kellis axiom in the sense of positive liberty, in that our y variables, the barriers, are barriers of perceived and social space. Perceived space, people seem to have a problem with travelling, seem to conceptualize journeys as harsh. Social space, well, it takes a long time, so the kind of human agency is not that much there. No high-speed trains or something like that. Perception manifests in attentional and egocentricity bias. We saw that attentional bias is not incredibly common. It's only in about 50% of our already few instances, but we do observe it. Egocentricity bias, in the sense of someone actually shifting to the perspective of the other, is again not very common. Affects about 30 to 40% of our relevant instances, that are few as it is. So what we basically have is conspicuous absence of references to the in-group, to the Manichaean group, and the strangers in the outside world. But ex silentio, we get the idea that this is a group of people that is trying to stay under the radar, trying not to draw any attention to themselves and to distance themselves as far as possible from the outside world. This does not mean that they do not interact with the outside world at all, but that they are attentionally or attitudinally very careful and cautious, such that we have the paradox of a basically unknown in-group. We don't know a lot about these people in the middle of the society. So they kind of hide in open daylight to a certain extent. They are very, very careful about what they are saying, and I think kind of there are a lot of missing values here that we basically have to account for. And that's it. This is why